The Value of Imagination. The Story of Jim Henson. A Value Tale by Anne Donegan Johnson. This tale is about the famous puppeteer and director Jim Henson. The story that follows is based on events in his life. More historical facts about Jim Henson can be found on page 63. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, there was a boy named Jim Henson. Jim was born in Greenville, Mississippi, but he lived in a world of imagination. James Murray Henson was born on September 24th, 1936. His father was a scientist, studying new types of plants and farm crops for animals to eat. Jim's mother was a housewife. Both parents did their best to provide a creative and stimulating environment for Jim and his older brother Paul. Jim went to elementary school in Leland, Mississippi. He loved learning new things and got good grades. Thanks to his vivid imagination, Jim did especially well in his favorite subject, art. In his free time, Jim painted and drew cartoons. He hoped to be a cartoonist someday. In the meantime, however, Jim used his art skills to illustrate school reports and projects. Jim also liked playing tennis with his brother and cards or board games with his friends. Another of Jim's hobbies was stamp collecting. Even though Jim was somewhat shy, he enjoyed participating in school plays. In his first school play, called Parade of Spices, Jim played Sage. He discovered that being on stage was fun, especially if he was wearing a costume. It gave him the opportunity to imagine and pretend that he was someone or something else, even if it was something as silly as a jar of spice. Like most other youngsters in the 1940s, Jim loved to listen to the radio. Television hadn't been invented yet, but there were many wonderful radio shows. One of Jim's favorites starred a famous Broadway ventriloquist named Edgar Bergen, and his two dummies, Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snerd. Charlie and Mortimer were just carved wooden dolls with movable mouths, but they sounded just like people when they wisecracked with Edgar's celebrity guests. It was easy for an imaginative child such as Jim to believe the puppets were real. When he was older, Jim's family moved to Hyattsville, Maryland, a small town near Washington, D.C. At University Park High School, Jim was the star of his art class, and he painted and designed scenery for school plays. Shy Jim even did some acting. Although he'd never had puppets as a child, Jim, perhaps inspired by his love of Edgar Bergen's dummies, joined the school puppet club just for fun. Jim was excited by the magic of the theater, where, thanks to the talents of the actors and the imagination of an audience, a few painted boards became a castle, and a few scraps of purple cloth turned into a royal robe. Or, in the case of puppets, those scraps could even become His Majesty the King. But magical as the theater was, Jim was even more excited by a new medium that became available around 1950. Television. Most people were satisfied with radio, but Jim couldn't wait to see television. He pleaded and pestered until his family finally bought a TV set. As soon as he saw his first show, Jim fell in love with TV. For a half hour every night, Jim was entranced by Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, a show starring hand puppets operated by Burr Tillstrom. In Tillstrom's expert hands, the puppets seemed to be alive. The show was spontaneous and silly. Tillstrom didn't write scripts. He made up the words on the spot. Kukla, Fran, and Ollie made a deep impression on young Jim. So did Bill and Cora Baird's puppet-filled television show, Life with a Snarky Parker. Suddenly, Jim knew what he wanted to do. More than anything, he wanted to work in television. Even though he was only 16, Jim went to all the television studios in Washington and applied for work. When he heard that one of the stations was looking for a puppeteer, Jim thought this might be his chance to get into television. With the help of one of his friends and a stack of puppetry books from the library, Jim set out to build some puppets. Up until then, Jim's experience with puppetry had been limited to building stage sets for the high school puppet club. But he did his best with his new TV project. Jim and his friend built some cowboy puppets and a French rat puppet named Pierre. They didn't look like any of the puppets in the puppetry books. Years later, Jim admitted it was probably just as well that he didn't know much about puppets when he first started. Whatever Jim may have lacked in education and experience, he made up with imagination. He developed his own construction methods, which made his puppets look different and special. To Jim's and his friends' amazement, they got the job. They were paid $5 per show. It wasn't much, but Jim and his friend were thrilled to be working in television. The junior morning show was a children's show that was broadcast live. Unfortunately, the show lasted only 3 weeks, but several newspapers gave it good reviews. Soon, Jim and his puppets were hired by the National Broadcasting Company for appearances on their local television shows. By the time Jim entered the University of Maryland, his career as a television puppeteer was growing. In college, Jim majored in art, but also took a course in puppetry. He was happiest when he was busy working on many different projects at the same time. Soon, Jim became interested in movies. As an experiment, he filmed some of his paintings. He would draw a few strokes, run the camera, draw a little more, then film again. When he played the film back, it seemed as if the painting was painting itself right before his eyes. Jim's dream of someday making movies was born. At the end of his first year of college, Jim got his big break. WRC-TV, a Washington station, offered him a chance to have his own show. The show, Sam and Friends, was only 5 minutes long, and it was on late at night, but it was all Jim needed to prove himself. Jim thought puppetry could be performed in a whole new way on TV. Traditional puppeteers had developed their craft for the theater, where puppeteers operated their puppets from above or below the stage. The puppeteers moved the puppets' bodies or changed the tone of their voices to express broad emotions to an audience that is sitting some distance away. Jim realized that there was something magic about television. The audience sees only what the camera sees. This made it easier for the puppeteer to stay out of sight, which helped the audience to imagine that the puppets were real. As he performed, Jim watched his puppets on a tiny TV screen below the stage that showed him what the audience was seeing. Jim also realized that TV puppets, like those in Sam and Friends, could look different. Since the puppets would be filmed close up, their faces could be more expressive than stage puppets. Instead of making puppet heads from wood or other stiff material, Jim covered a base of foam rubber with a stretch fabric like that used to make sweatshirts. The flexible faces could then be pinched and stretched to express many different feelings. The tiniest eyebrow wiggle or the most subtle smile were visible to a close-up camera. Jim also experimented with new ways to manipulate his puppets, methods that worked especially well for television. He combined marionettes, dolls with strings for the puppeteer to pull, and hand puppets, which are moved by the puppeteer's hand inside them. Because his puppets were unlike any others, Jim gave them a new name: Muppets. The Sam and Friends characters weren't modeled on anyone Jim knew. They came straight from his vivid imagination. Jim liked to make the puppets that didn't look like anything real. One was a sort of half-lizard, half-frog creature made of cloth from his mother's old green spring coat. The eyes were made from two halves of a ping-pong ball. His name was Kermit. Eventually, Kermit was remade in a brighter, happier green and changed to look more like a frog. The power of imagination made it possible for Jim to transform ordinary things around him into fantastic new creations. The name of one of his dad's plants, Bird's Foot, became a scientist puppet, Herbert Birdsfoot, and before long his mom's old coat would be a world-famous frog. Although he had enrolled in college as an art major, Jim's freshman puppetry teacher persuaded him to switch from fine arts, which required math and science, to home economics, which included courses in costume design, interior design, and puppetry. In puppetry class, Jim met Jane Nebel, another talented young puppeteer. Busy with school and Sam and Friends, Jim asked Jane to help out on the show. They worked well together and were soon close friends. Jim didn't take Sam and Friends too seriously, and neither did the station, so Jim could do whatever he wanted. To him, it was a fun way to earn money to pay for school, and a chance to let his imagination run wild. Some of the shows were strange, but they were always fun and interesting, and the show was a hit. Jim was invited to perform on other shows, and soon had a contract for $100 a week to cover the cost of puppets, costumes, and sets. To a college student, that was a lot of money, just for having fun. In 1957, Jim was asked to perform on national television on The Tonight Show. He brought with him the improved Kermit, who had literally become Jim's right hand. Kermit wore a blonde wig and saying, "I've grown accustomed to your face," to a purple monster puppet operated by Jane. As Kermit sang, "The monster ate his own face, then tried to eat Kermit too." The following year, Jim and Jane were hired to make a series of commercials for a local brand of coffee. Jim didn't like coffee, and he thought most commercials were boring. So instead of just saying, "Buy our coffee, it's the best," Jim tried using humor. In the first commercial, a happy character named Willie asked grouchy Wantkins what he thought of Wilkins coffee. Wantkins said he'd never tried it. Willie produced a cannon and blasted the grouch, then turned his cannons on the audience and asked, "What do you think of Wilkins coffee?" It quickly became the most popular commercial in Washington, D.C. People remembered the Wilkins name and bought the coffee, perhaps because the commercial made them laugh. And it sold a lot of coffee. Jim and Jane were asked to do many more commercials. Soon, they were selling coffee for companies all over the country. Jim made so many commercials and earned so much money that he drove to his college graduation in a Rolls-Royce automobile. But, successful as he was, Jim felt something was missing in his life. He wasn't sure he wanted to be a puppeteer. After all, he had started out wanting to be an artist. Puppets were just something he had done for fun. But now they were taking over his life. Jim left Jane in charge of the business and their Emmy award-winning show, Sam and Friends. He took 3 months off to travel in Europe and paint. In every city he visited in Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, and England, Jim attended the local puppet theater. He was surprised at how many puppet shows were being performed, and very pleased to discover that in Europe, puppets were not just for children. People of all ages attended the shows, and the puppeteers were proud of their long tradition of puppetry as theater and a form of art. They took their work seriously and did lots of interesting things, not just selling coffee or entertaining kids. In Europe, Jim found puppets performing all kinds of plays. Some were silly, others were serious and dramatic. Jim came back from Europe with 2 important decisions: to continue working in puppets and to marry Jane. The newlyweds set up their first company. It was called Muppets Incorporated. In 1960, the Hensons' first child, Lisa, was born. Jim discovered that raising children was as much fun as making puppets. Soon, the Hensons had 4 more children: Cheryl, Brian, John Paul, and Heather. Jim loved to fly kites with his kids and, when they were old enough, to go skiing and play tennis together. Jim believed that all adults were really children on the inside, and he never stopped enjoying scary rides at amusement parks, skateboarding, or just acting silly. Jim brought the same spirit of fun to his work. Soon, Jane was too busy raising children to work full-time. So Jim attended puppetry festivals around the country looking for talented performers to join his creative team. Don Salin had worked for Clucka, Fran, and Ollie, puppet master, Burr Tillstrom. Jim hired Don to make 2 dog Muppet characters for a television commercial. One of those dogs learned to play the piano and became the beloved Rolf. Don went on to become a key designer of Muppet characters. Jerry Jewell started as a performer, but later became an important writer in Jim's organization. Jim also wanted to hire a very talented teenage puppeteer named Frank Osnowitz. But he had to wait for Frank to grow up. Once Frank Oz joined Jim, he never left, eventually creating some of the best-loved Muppets characters, including Miss Piggy, Animal, and Fozzie Bear. The 2 puppeteers became close friends, just like their puppet pals, Bert and Ernie. The early Muppets characters varied widely until designer Don Stalin settled on a basic style, which included a wide, saucer-shaped mouth, round nose, and big eyes. By changing costumes, noses, ears, eyebrows, and other features, the clever designers created hundreds of characters based on about 15 basic types. Muppets characters are operated in different ways. In-hand and rod characters such as Kermit, Miss Piggy, and Grover, one puppeteer moves the character's mouth, while another works rods that move its hands. The rods are painted to blend with the background, so they don't show. A single puppeteer can operate hand puppets, such as Rolf or Ernie, with one hand inside the character's mouth and the other hand in the puppet's hand. If the puppet needs to move both its hands, as when Rolf plays the piano, a second puppeteer operates the other hand. Large Muppet characters, such as Big Bird and the giant monster, Sweet Tums, hide a puppeteer and a built-in television screen inside the costume. The puppeteer sees through a carefully disguised opening and creates movements using various hand and rod devices, watching his performance on the small TV screen inside the costume. The dialogue was usually recorded live as the puppeteers performed, using small microphones on headbands. Jim's Muppets characters became very popular. One day, he was asked to make them a part of a new children's show for public television. The idea behind the show was to use TV to make learning exciting and fun. Actors, puppets, and cartoon characters would perform songs and skits designed to help preschoolers remember numbers, letters, and concepts, such as near and far. Some of the same techniques Jim had developed to sell coffee would be used to help children learn. Jim believed home, school, and television were the 3 most important influences on children. He hoped he could use television to reach out to many youngsters with his puppets and encourage them to learn and grow, just as he had always encouraged his own children. So Jim agreed to work on the show, even though no one expected it would be a great success. Jim remembered telling his manager a few days before the first filming, "Incidentally, I'm working on this little children's show. It's an educational thing, and I'm only doing it because I believe in it." The show was called Sesame Street. Jim and his team created many wonderful characters for Sesame Street, including Oscar the Grouch, Cookie Monster, Grover, Bert and Ernie, and of course, Big Bird. It was hard work, but it was also fun. Many children learned the alphabet without even realizing they were being taught a lesson because they were too busy laughing. Sesame Street quickly became one of the most popular television shows ever. By the early 1970s, 6 million preschoolers were finding their way to the famous street. Jim's puppets received more fan mail than the actors. Jim won 2 Emmys for outstanding achievement in the field of children's programming, a gold record for $1 million in sales of an album, and many other awards. Jim was glad kids loved Sesame Street characters, but he still wanted to reach an adult audience. He also wanted more of a chance to develop personalities for his creations, and that meant creating a show all their own. He went to the TV networks with an idea for The Muppet Show, a show the whole family would watch together. But all of the networks said, "No, puppets are just for kids." None of them was willing to take a chance on something different. Jim remembered how different the attitude towards puppets was in Europe. So he went there. Lew Grade, a British businessman, gave Jim the money he needed and encouraged him to do whatever he wanted. Now Kermit, Miss Piggy, and the others could stage big musical numbers, and there would be 24 shows each year. Plenty of time for the characters to develop personalities and relationships. Though The Muppet Show was born in England, Grade soon sold it to TV stations in more than 100 countries. The Muppets characters became the most popular puppets in the world, not just with children, but with adults as well. In fact, 3/4 of The Muppet Show's huge audience was made up of adults. The Muppet Show was a bit like the Edgar Bergen radio show that Jim had loved as a child. But thanks to television and Jim's vivid imagination, The Muppet Show reached new heights of hilarity. Jim's puppets not only interviewed celebrities, they performed skits, songs, and danced with them. Sometimes the whole set would come alive with singing squirrels, cows, or frogs. Even the audience was made up of puppets. Many famous, talented people joined Kermit, Miss Piggy, Gonzo, and the Muppet Show gang. 3 guest stars Jim was especially proud to have on the show were Edgar Bergen and his dummies, Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snurd. The popularity of Sesame Street and The Muppet Show helped another of Jim's dreams come true. Soon, he was making movies. Many people noticed the similarity between the story of Kermit in the Muppet movie and Jim's own rise from a quiet childhood to fame and fortune in show business. Just as Kermit met Fozzie, Piggy, Gonzo, and other friends on the road to success, Jim had met Frank, Oz, Jerry Gould, Don Solon, and others who responded to his dream and his gentle leadership. People had almost as much fun watching the Muppets movies as Jim and the other puppeteers had making them. The movies were rainbow-filled flights of fantasy in which anything could happen. Even a wedding cake might burst into song. Miss Piggy's fantasy of herself and Kermit as babies in the Muppets Take Manhattan delighted audiences so much that Jim invented a cartoon show based on the adventures of Baby Piggy, Baby Kermit, and their friends. The show, Muppet Babies, was a celebration of the power of imagination. In each episode, the babies took fantastic journeys without ever leaving their nursery. Jim explored a darker side of his imagination in the all-puppet adventure movie, The Dark Crystal. Inspired by the dreamy drawings of Brian Froud, Jim imagined a whole new world while he was snowed in at Kennedy Airport during a blizzard in 1978. To turn his vision of evil Skeksis and good Gelflings into reality, Jim had to take puppets further than anyone had ever dreamed. With the help of his creature shop in London, Jim created elaborate electronic and radio-controlled puppets. Jim pushed the art of puppetry even further in his next film flight of imagination, Labyrinth, a tale of goblins and other strange creatures. Two of Jim's children, Cheryl and Brian, worked as puppet builders and performers for Labyrinth. All the Henson children were inspired by their father's creative energy to go into show business. As Cheryl explained, "We grew up in TV studios. We all enjoyed being around him. And one of the best ways of being around him was to work with him, because when he was working, he was always at his peak." Brian appreciated his father's wonderful goals and wonderful dreams. Jim loved exploring new forms of technology as much as he loved creating new worlds with puppets. He saw a world of infinite possibilities. As Jerry Gould once put it, "If it's possible with puppets, Henson will probably try it." Jim loved his work and once said, "Many people think of work as something to avoid. I think of work as something to seek." So even though he could have retired on his fortune, Jim went on to create a whole new puppet world for cable TV. Fraggle Rock was populated by tiny, remote-controlled doozers, fun-loving Fraggles, and giant Gorgs. The message behind the fun was one close to Jim's heart, that all kinds of different creatures must learn to live together in peace. Jim always juggled several projects at a time, and even helped other artists bring the worlds of their imagination to life. One of Jim's designers was responsible for the creation of Yoda, Luke Skywalker's Jedi Master in Star Wars, and Jim himself designed the flexible and expressive masks used in the hit movie Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Jim Henson built an empire based on fun and imagination. His advice to young people was, "Follow your enthusiasm. Do what you enjoy doing." From an old green coat and a vivid imagination, Jim created Kermit the Frog, a character recognized and loved around the world, not only on TV and film, but in ice shows, books, magazines, records, toys, on sheets, clothes, and even in computer software. Jim's imagination was a bottomless well of new stories, characters, and inventions. He was always dreaming up projects for the future. Jim was hard at work on a new TV series and plans for the debut of a Muppets show at Disney World when he came down with a bad cold. The cold turned into pneumonia and a strep infection. By the time Jim began taking antibiotics, it was too late. Jim Henson died on May 16th, 1990, at the age of 53. Jim Henson lives on in the many delightful characters he created and the beautiful world full of rainbows and laughter he helped others imagine. His TV shows and movies have brightened the lives of countless children and adults. He built an entertainment empire, all based on the power of imagination.